Thank you everyone for joining us for this conversation. Already I feel like it sounds like such a different discussion from what it used to be many years ago, just because this work is not without challenges. As we think about the urgency of climate change, as we think about 2020, both as an environmental and a political moment in our lifetimes, to think about how do we give the space and agency to folks to both bring about this change, but also acknowledge that mistakes will be made in the process, and how do we support each other through that. Many years of working on environment and environmental justice. Bernice, if I can start with you and ask you to talk a little bit about why the focus on equity, why now, and what role do you think boards and leaders have to play in this space?
Well, I think in terms of, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And it's true, I've been in this space and doing this work for 35 years, and I'm happy to say that thanks to my parents, I don't look nearly as old as I am. Yeah. But I have been in this space for a really long time and been exceedingly frustrated at the glacial pace. And glacial used to mean incrementally slow. It doesn't mean that anymore, but let's just reflect on that interpretation for a minute. And it was very difficult for the staff who were the early pioneers in working inside green groups to not have folks on the boards who really understood the difficulties that staff had trying to change organizational culture, trying to advance an integration of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within the missions of those organizations. And sometimes the pushback was incredibly intense and incredibly racist. And I just want to make sure that people understand that where we are now is such a long way from where we were. But still, we have these episodic moments where we have leaders of color in green groups at the board level. So notably the Sierra Club and the National Wildlife Federation have had people of color as the chairs of their board. It was historic when that happened in both organizations. And that happened within the last 10 years. In a movement that's been around for 50 years, right? So we are just at the beginning of really making this breakthrough. And I just want to say that to Green Leadership Trust, of who I am a member, when we first came together to start this effort, I was not a believer. And Michael can tell you, I used to give him a hard time all the time. So what is the point? We get a few more people of color on the boards of these organizations, and what changes? Well, what you heard from these CEOs is what changes, right? The mission of the organizations, really re-looking at a deep level. Who are we? Who do we want to be? What are we trying to accomplish politically? What space are we trying to be in? And what are we trying to accomplish politically? And at a policy level, how can we continue to do that while we leave half or more of the population outside of the conversation and outside of the decision making about what is important? So I'll leave off with this last anecdote in answer to your question. The first week after Barack Obama was sworn in, one of the first policy issues that President Obama addressed was raising the fuel efficiency standards for all vehicles on the roads in the U.S. And there was a signing of this document, of this executive order, by the president and by then EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson and the CEQ director, White House Council on Environmental Quality director. And so a lot of people were invited in the environmental community, and for the first time, the people standing outside the White House trying to get into the White House were a truly diverse audience. And what we're really trying to do is create culture change in these organizations, except most of the time, we don't acknowledge that that's what we're trying to do. And so there's some people who are on that train and some people who are not on that train, right? And that's where the conflict comes in. But you have to have buy-in from everybody about why we are doing this work and why we're moving in this direction. And I think the question that everyone asks or wants to have answered is, and what does this have to do with advancing the mission of our organization? And we have to be able to answer that question, right? So there's got to be a case statement that we all develop that's unique to our own organizations, or if we're part of the parks and recreation conversation or the water conversation, we're in different parts of the movement, right? But we have to have a case statement for why this is important, not just because it's morally the right thing to do, or because the demographics are changed and pretty soon it's going to be less of you and more of these other people, and we don't want our organizations to go away, which is a reality, right? But the case statement has got to be articulated so very clearly that people feel it in their souls, that the reason that I come to work at this organization, or the reason that I serve on this board, is because we're moving an agenda that includes all these policy issues. And so let me just lift up the environmental justice movement in this moment, because we have been working on that for 40 years. And so now we're at this moment where we're talking about the fiber of our organizations. We don't just want to do it because a funder says, you know, your organization is too white, right? And people are saying that, right? Or they're giving you these things, these diversity, I know we used to do this at the Ford Foundation. We give you this diversity chart as part of your grant application. And if you're checking off all zeros, it says you ain't got no people of color in your organization, we're moving that grant consideration to the far, far, far left, right? Which is otherwise known as a garbage can. And people have done things like that to move the conversation, but that's a directive. That is not a culture change, right? That's somebody telling you that you need to do it externally for some reason. What I think we've been asking, and what these metrics are giving us an ability to do, is say, how are we changing the culture of our organizations, and therefore the culture of our community and the culture of our movement, so that people feel included and they see themselves in this space. That's why we created an environmental justice movement, because we didn't see ourselves in this space. So we created our own space, and then we moved it on and we took it over, right? And we drove the conversation. And now we're talking about it's time for integration, right? It's time for us to all be standing in the same spot, lifting up the same values, moving towards the same set of goals. And you can move there in a variety of ways, but at least can we all be walking in the same direction? I am so tired of running back and forth between these two conversations. I'm getting too damn old for this, okay? I don't have the energy that I had 35 years ago. I need us all in one room with one mission, with one set of goals and objectives that we're spanning across the country to move that agenda. And to do that, you need culture change at a fundamental level. The metrics are about transformation, right? Not, again, incrementalist. We're still on this journey. But where we are now, Green Leadership Trust, these metrics, the research that has been done, has really helped to kick open this conversation at a level and in a way that it had not been before. And I just need to say to my colleagues who were part of the founding of Green Leadership Trust, okay, it was a good idea.
Hi, I'm Nicole Silk, and I'm Executive Director of River Network, and this is my board chair, Rebecca Water. So this has been really, really helpful. We too have been on a journey since I stepped into the role about 6 years ago. And it's deep, and it's at the board level, it's at the C-suite, it's all across staff. So I really appreciate your perspectives. My question has to do with the amount of, if we're really serious about this work, it requires deep intentionality across all of us executive directors. It requires that we are both incredibly authentic and extremely vulnerable about who we are, how we come in, what our history is, so that we're enabling everybody else to bring that forward as well, to create those spaces where people can bring their full selves in. So my question for you all is really about those situations where you've had to be very vulnerable in public spaces beyond your organization, and the times when you've been slapped down, and how do you bring yourself back up and be the model that you have to be, not only for your organization, but for the larger movement that you're part of?
You know, you have to recognize your own white privilege. You have to be willing to step up and say things that are even uncomfortable for me to hear. But you know, it's you just have to be willing to do that, and you know, and say, hey, you know what, I don't know the right words all the time, and I'm saying it. In fact, I say diverse people or do different things. It's not the right language. I'm still learning, absolutely. But it's, you know, where your heart is and where you're trying to go, and keep just moving in the right direction and learning and being open to it.
I've been learning a lot about white fragility and you know, the that you mentioned as well as other work that we've been doing, and one of the most powerful things was that when it comes to race, many white people don't want to talk about it because, in fact, and by not talking about it, it preserves the status quo and the oppressive power structure that has existed in this country for so long. So we've got to get comfortable in navigating race and talking about it comfortably, and just to talk about, stepping in it. So we all, just days ago, we had a session with our all staff, and myself and several senior leaders talked about in very vulnerable ways what we learned in our reflections and how challenging it was to speak. And then I heard from somebody later, it's like, we don't need to hear like how challenging it was for white people to talk about race. We have to do this all the time. So thinking about the emotional labor that we often put on our staff of color in this work is something to really be cognizant of. We're going to step in it, fix it. This is not about making ourselves feel better because it's hard, but about listening, being open to critical feedback, and making the changes going forward. I think that's what I was taking away from the last 2 weeks of learning how to do it anyway.
But I would agree. I mean, it's admit it, apologize for it, fix it, and then go home that night and
Drink.
And just to clarify, the reason I asked that question is because we've had occasions where we've been extremely vulnerable in public places about our journey and our mistakes, and it's been really good and really humbling. But I actually think it's part of I think it should be part of the evaluation tool. I think it's incumbent on us to be modeling that practice beyond our organizations, so that we encourage other executive directors to do the same, to challenge the status quo, to be impatient. We gotta get beyond this, right? Yeah, it's uncomfortable, fine, let's move.
I would just add in closing 2 concepts: grace and assume good intentions, right? Assume that people are coming from the best place that they can. And we all can be educated about a whole variety of issues and a whole variety of ways to receive people and to hear stuff. Now, if you had known me 35 years ago, you would never hear me say what I just said, right? Because grace just was not what I did. But I remember something my grandmother tried to teach me my whole life, and I was 32 when she died. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And you would have thought that was the most conflated concept of physics that there ever was, because I could not understand what she was trying to tell me. But over the years, I have come to understand that if you approach people with grace, even if it's about a really difficult conversation on a really difficult set of issues, at least you have the basis for a conversation and a dialogue, right? Not a diatribe, but a dialogue. And I don't want people to feel bad about the things that I said. Okay, let me correct that. I don't want people to feel bad now about the things that we say in these spaces. I want people to walk away with an open heart and an open mind, and the ability to come back again and again as we continue to struggle through this conversation, which is difficult. And we don't have the language and we don't have the tools, but if we're going to get to where we're going to get to, we have to assume good intentions and give each other the grace to make mistakes and say things that may not be the right thing, but that our hearts are in the right places, right?